I'm Raquel Flinker. I am a senior water resources engineer and project manager with the Colorado River District. And for those who have never heard of the Colorado River District, we are a government entity, and we protect and represent Colorado West Slope water interests. We cover 15 counties that form the headwaters of the Yampa, White, Gunnison, and Colorado rivers. And we also represent and protect state interests under the Colorado River Compact. So today I will be moderating this panel, and I would like to introduce our three panelists. First, we'll start with Dr. Perry Cabot. Dr. Perry Cabot is an extension professor at the Western Colorado Research Center that's focused on water resources, integrated cropping systems, and climate-smart agriculture. He is also the Irrigation and Water Resource Specialist for the CSU Office of Extension and Engagement in the Western region of the state. We also have Dr. Mallika Nocco. She is the Assistant Cooperative Extension Professor in Soil Plant Water Relations and Irrigation Management in the Department of Land, Air, and Water Resources at UC Davis. She works with growers, policymakers, and water districts to develop irrigation management strategies that balance farm livelihoods, soil health, and water conservation. Mallika co-hosts the Water Talk podcast and directs Conservation Irrigation Lab. Welcome. And lastly, Dr. Claudia Ringler. She is Director of Natural Resources and Resilience of the International Food Policy Research Institute. She coordinates research at the intersection of nature, agriculture, and development for tangible progress toward more equitable and resilient food systems. So welcome to our panelists. If we could give them a warm welcome here. And so we will start with a brief presentation from each of our panelists. They will each have around 5 minutes to present. Then we'll move to some questions that I have prepared and a conversation between the four of us. And we will then move to questions from the general public. So, write some notes and get ready to ask our panelists some questions. So I will turn it over to Dr. Perry Cabot.
Sounds good. Well, she's getting ready. I just want to thank you to the Colorado River District for putting this event on, and I appreciate the Change Institute for inviting me. I thought I'd just start with kind of an interesting quote. This is from a colleague of one of my fellow panelists here at UC Davis that was in the New York Times, and Professor Frank was quoted as saying, "We're confronting a 21st century climate change problem with drought and water supply problems with a 20th century system of water infrastructure and a 19th century system of water rights." And I want to point out that this is not intended to be provocative, because when I've given this talk before, it sort of sounds like there's a clarion call to change the water rights system, and that is not at all what this is. This is essentially the world in which I live. The fixed components of that are, in my mind, the water rights system, and the climate change issue is paramount. So the thing that we can play around with is this issue of the infrastructure in the middle. So I'm going to have you go ahead and next slide. So I'm involved in a project that is part of, I guess, a component of that project is artificial intelligence. And of course, that's the big thing that everybody wants to talk about these days. So now it is, it's made its way into agriculture, not surprisingly. So go ahead and talk about the next slide. We were fortunate at the research center down in Fruita, with the support of the Colorado River District, to build a sophisticated state-of-the-art linear move irrigation system. So when I say linear move, this is contrasted with your sort of pivot that people are more familiar with. This is essentially like instead of a windshield wiper, this is a sideways going back and forth. So you can, instead of turning your square field into a circle and wasting the corners, you're essentially now farming the entire thing. There are other aspects of managing it that are more complicated, but the really interesting thing about this is it has what we call variable rate irrigation. So the unit that you're looking at here has what we call drop nozzles, and each of those drop nozzles is controlled by an actuator. actually each four of those drop nozzles is controlled by an actuator, which essentially means I can control irrigation from on the basis of every four of those nozzles into these little zones. So this is a pretty heavy step for most farmers, but we're talking about reimagining agriculture. And as we do that, with less people, we're going to need to accept the fact that robots and other sort of non-human machines are going to have to play a role. So go to the next slide. So basically, artificial intelligence is really difficult to explain in 5 minutes or even an hour, but essentially what you can imagine this is almost like your phone, that makes changes as you tell the thing to, I say a word wrong and I keep correcting that word, and eventually the phone figures out that the word I'm trying to say when I finally say it is the word I want it to write down. So that gives me the kind of parallel to the work we do at the research center, where that system eventually is going to respond to in-field data that we take that is then intended to create the result that I want. So this loop, through the AI programming software, enables us to learn from the trends that we see, the sort of static and dynamic variables in the field. Next slide. The ultimate goal is to smooth out this map. What you're looking at is a continuous yield map of our field, showing that we've got literally double the yields in some parts of the field than others. So my goal is to get that smoothed out, more uniform and bigger if possible, with an optimal use of resources, nitrogen, other kinds of fertilizers, and inputs, and also water. Next slide. How that happens is through a piece of software that we've been working on with the company Renke, whereby this is like kind of a checkerboard map of how those zones that the programmed software gives input to the machine, and it gives the nozzles I spoke about the ability, the knowledge to change as it moves through the field. So you're asking yourself, well, how in the heck does somebody come up with this map? Because if you're a farmer, you don't have a place to start. Well, that's where the AI software is going to come in our use of this model, is help us design this map on the basis of these active and static variables. So getting to the point where essentially these maps can be produced for farmers for every what we call irrigation prescription is where we're trying to go. In the next slide. So that's how we're reimagining irrigation at the Research Center, and I just want to also point out, and I think we're going to hear a little bit about this maybe in Q&A, but what we are effectively irrigating also matters. So we're engaged in a lot of alternative forage research with the Land Institute, looking at crops that use less water or can withstand drought to a greater degree, thereby giving farmers more flexibility than these kind of brown and down, lease and cease types of programs that we've seen. So, how we're putting the water on and what we're actually using it for is part of what we're doing at the Research Center.
Thank you very much, Dr. Perry. And now let's move to Mallika to give, so I should reiterate this. So Perry gave us a more of a local perspective, and so Mallika is going to give more of a regional perspective, and then we will move to Claudia, who's going to be talking more on a global level. So turn it over to you.
Yeah, hello. Thanks, Perry. That was wonderful to hear more about what you're doing. Some really cutting edge work going on around here. That's awesome. So I'm a California person. I'm at UC Davis, and I am honored to be here to just learn more from all of you and the panelists about what's happening in this area, and just think a little bit about Western agriculture and Western water together. In terms of California ag, we are growing about 1/3 of the vegetables and 2/3 of the fruits and nuts for the United States. And the irrigation is compulsory in much of the places that this stuff is grown in California, right? So we see the big Central Valley here, and I'm sure a lot of folks here have heard of the Imperial Valley in the south. The crops that I am primarily focused on in my research group are almonds, grapes, and processing tomatoes. And I have a research and extension position really similar to Perry's, but in California. So next slide, please. So just a little bit about my position. So I have this statewide responsibility for extension in soil plant water relations and irrigation management. And in California's extension system, we think of it as like a bridge, in that there are county offices and there are extension professionals, extension advisors, who are experts in all of the different counties on like the local cropping systems. And, you know, as a statewide extension professor, I coordinate with these local experts to think about problems for the state of California. Next slide. Okay, so these are the things that we work on, and this is where it was nice what Perry presented, because I do a lot of really similar work, but in the crops that are grown in California. So we do precision agriculture, and we think a lot about monitoring crop water stress and just doing like precision irrigation, but with our crops that we're growing in California. So I'm also making those very high resolution maps, but instead, you know, of thinking of, you know, a forage, potentially it'll be like a lot of almond trees, but also like a very high resolution map of water use. We also are working on optimization of irrigation. So I do work on deficit irrigation issues, but, you know, I am not working really on deficit irrigation that doesn't come with some sort of a win-win. So usually it's like deficit irrigation, but thinking about how it coincides with managing diseases, or thinking about how it coincides with improving crop quality, like making a tomato taste sweeter or be more nutritious, as an example. The other area of work that I'm focusing on is regenerative irrigation. So how can we combine soil health practices and irrigation management together? So an example of this is in California, a lot of folks are really concerned about the amount of water that cover crops are using. So we're doing a lot of work on very low water using cover crops, and cover crops that are, you know, designer cover crops that are intended to use very little water but still potentially provide soil health benefits to kind of address that problem. But then we're also thinking about how we can do managed aquifer recharge. So when we get these large rain events and the flood events that we saw this year in California, how do we capture those waters, and how do we prepare our soils and maintain our soils to have the best possible infiltration when we can actually infiltrate the water? So that's the work that we're doing. Next slide, please. And I can't come all the way to Colorado without, without sharing that I have a podcast with all of you and asking you to listen to it. So, you know, we're available on Spotify, iTunes, wherever you listen to podcasts, but we do cover a lot of Western water issues. So if you are interested in listening, like we started as just a California, not just, but we started as a California podcast, and now we're kind of starting to expand to the Western United States and think about Western water issues in general. So check us out. And I think that's my last slide, but I'm not sure. Okay, great, thanks.
Thank you so much, Mallika. And now we'll move to Claudia.
Yeah, so this slide obviously shows a slightly different perspective. So I'm with the International Food Policy Research Institute. We are headquartered in Washington, D.C., and we are a member of the world's largest agricultural research network, dedicated only to addressing food insecurity challenges of low and middle income countries. So there's a total of 15 international agricultural research centers. We have an umbrella organization, and we are dedicated to, I guess, the three areas that are important for agriculture and food security, and that is crop breeding. So there's, for example, breeding centers in the Philippines for rice, and in Mexico for wheat and maize. We have a livestock research center based in Kenya. We have crops in the semi-arid tropics. We have a research center focused on dry areas, and on it goes. There's a fish center, so just focus on fisheries. And there's also a water center called the International Water Management Institute. IFPRI, where I'm based, or that I'm working in, is focusing on policy. So they started with only the breeding centers, and they realized, a lot of the food security issues are not just breeding better crops and also better agronomic practices, but we also need good policy. So, trade policy, institutions, for example, water use associations, groundwater development policies, whatever it is. So from a policy perspective, what do we need to do differently to support food security? There's also social safety nets, cash transfers, food transfers, whatever, you name it, anything that addresses food security. And so we also have a large group of nutritionists, because we know that dietary adequacy is a very big problem in much of the world, pretty much everywhere in the world. Just the problems are quite different. So I guess, as you might know, for many decades, food prices have been declining, which has helped poor people in poor countries to access food. But over the last 15 years, we have seen 3 food price crises, so very rapid increases in food prices. They were generally linked or not linked, but at the same time, we have seen energy price shocks. We're still more or less in a food price shock situation, very high food inflation globally, so including in the United States, but obviously the food price inflation levels are much higher in many low-income countries, up to 240% in Lebanon, 40-50% in Pakistan or Ethiopia. So with these food price challenges, we've seen severe increases in food insecurity. We currently have around 800 million people who are undernourished or who basically go to bed hungry. So it's a huge number. So that's about 10% of the world's population. The numbers have been going up over the last couple of years due to growing civil conflict, war-type situations, sometimes fueled by climate extreme events. So long-term droughts, flooding, and obviously this growing inequity and inequality that we see again globally. We see it, of course, also here in the United States. So no country is really immune, from some of those challenges. And in addition to this very high number of hungry people, we also have about 2 billion people with micronutrient deficiencies. So that means lack of iron, vitamin A, vitamin D, you name it. And those micronutrient deficiencies also cause a lot of health challenges, morbidity, mortality, lack of cognitive functions. In fact, there's a lot of food insecurity related health implications through wasting and stunting. So children that are too short for their age, that are too thin for their height, and those challenges again are associated with limited cognitive functions, reduced lifetime earning capabilities, and on it goes. So basically, it's a moral challenge that we all face, and it's a challenge that we all can only address together. And so our centers are trying to focus on improving agricultural productivity. And so the images that you see here, there's many ways to improve agricultural productivity, but irrigation is one. And obviously living, people in the Western United States obviously have figured that out as well, that irrigation can dramatically increase your agricultural productivity. Globally, most irrigation is in Asia, where it's largely used for rice, but also lots of other crops. On the other hand, in Sub-Saharan Africa, only about 5% of the cultivated area is currently irrigated. They have huge interannual variability in terms of rainfall. And with climate change, climate extremes, it's becoming more difficult to farm, and so there's a lot of interest to see what irrigation could do to increase agricultural productivity. And just so I put some images from different parts of the world. Bottom right is Kenya. That's maize if you don't have irrigation. Next to it is Western India, Northwest India, where we see the largest groundwater depletion of anywhere in the world because of very, very poor public policy, which is free electricity, then very high subsidies actually for solar pumps that also could lead to more rapid groundwater depletion, minimum support price for basic staples, which sounds like a good thing because we want to have low prices for basic staple crops, but they shouldn't be grown in that area, so they have extreme extreme drawdown of aquifers, that are basically cannot be replenished at the levels that they're currently drawing down the groundwater. But this lady owns a solar panel for very little irrigation. As you can see, with that panel, you can't irrigate a lot, but you can irrigate. And we also want to make sure that women have access to irrigation technologies. It makes a big difference for health investments, nutrition investments. On the top, that's southern India. They're transplanting rice, paddy. Top west is motor pump, irrigation. I think that's Ghana. Bottom left, this is a multiple-use water system. So this little hand pump is used for livestock watering, little irrigation, domestic uses. They use it for everything. This is, I think, Eastern Africa. And then the bottom one is probably the closest to what we might have here in the Western United States. This is Egypt, where you have one of the world's largest irrigation system. Pakistan would look about the same, where you have the world's largest contiguous irrigated area. So they still use surface canal irrigation. Those are very old systems. I mean, Egypt is thousands of years old. But they also obviously all face a lot of water shortages and water scarcity. So the problems are somewhat similar. In Asia, we are looking at, we are trying to make those systems more efficient, similar, I think, to what we hear here. In sub-Saharan Africa and parts of South Asia, we are trying to expand access to irrigation. And especially in sub-Saharan Africa, we are trying to see how we can grow access to sustainable irrigation, which is always the big challenge, right? Because as soon as irrigation takes off, we again will see some depletion of water resources. And particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, most of this irrigation is farmers buy their own technology. You don't have those big contiguous systems like in Egypt or Pakistan. Yeah, I think that's all as an introduction. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the three of you. It really is a pleasure to be here and speaking to these three experts. And with my work at the Colorado River District, we are very focused at the Colorado River Basin. And so, Claudia, your perspective on the challenges across the globe is really a great perspective, I think, for all of us here, but for me as well. And so the crisis on the Colorado River has made headlines across, the United States, but also across the world. And I think it would be interesting for this conversation if the three of you could speak a little bit more about how much water is used for agriculture within the basin, but also regionally and globally, and how, when we talk about water, we end up talking about agriculture and irrigation with it. So I thought maybe, Perry, if you would like to start with a basin, like Colorado Basin perspective, and then we can move to Mallika and Claudia.
Well, I mean, we know that let's call it 85% of the water diverted in Colorado is used for agriculture. So it's certainly the dominant fraction of our water use, but and we could dwell on, the acre footage and how much of that is used, but let's counter that point by acknowledging that agriculture is food production, and I hope I think this is a really valid point. And I was talking with Claudia earlier. We often hear the term ecosystem services in our vernacular as scientists, but agroecosystem services is food production. So when we talk in the, as a sort of compartmentalized water use of agriculture, I think it's fair to say that what we should be saying is this is food production, and so this is a societal need. And food production is akin to infrastructure. I mean, if we don't have roads, and we can't, if we don't have food, we can't move ourselves around to do the things that we do. So I think that's I think it's a more interesting launch point for a discussion about how we value agriculture and how we want to support it in our basin.
Thanks. Mallika and Claudia, if you would like to add to that, I think that would be great.
Okay, maybe, we just heard 80 to 85% of Colorado River water is used for agriculture, irrigation, and globally about 70% of water resources that are withdrawn are used also for agriculture, but in low and middle income countries it's closer to 90%, so it's almost everything. We have very little industry. As I said, it's a multiple use system. You use the same water. There's not a lot, especially in rural areas, you don't have very good, there's not a lot of infrastructure at all. And in urban areas, because those cities grow very fast, so the infrastructure is also really not supplying a lot of domestic or drinking water. So that's why most of the water is also used for agriculture. So it's basically quite similar. So what's done in the Colorado as compared to low and middle income countries. For high income countries, Colorado River water extraction for agriculture is obviously higher than average, which again I think is reflected in the fact that you have a somewhat dry climate here, and it's obviously getting drier and drier. And so that's why you have but that kind of share. But obviously globally we see this rapidly growing competition between withdrawals for agriculture and withdrawals for residential and industrial purposes. The value of water in these other sectors is basically always higher. And so we have seen this very, very long-term trend globally of water moving out of irrigated agriculture and moving into the domestic and industrial sectors. It's very well documented for the American West because you have great numbers and you have a lot of water trade. In the rest of the world, the water is just being expropriated from farmers, and it just moves into urban industrial areas by simply building infrastructure, right? So the water just doesn't arrive on farms. So it's done differently. There's pretty much never a compensation. Just I guess my addition here. Yeah.
Do folks know what an acre foot is? Yeah? All right, I love it. Okay, so I figured as much. But so just in case for the folks online, an acre foot, you can imagine an acre of land and a foot of water spread over it, and about 2.4 million acre feet of water moves from the Colorado River to the Imperial Valley of California. So when I showed you the map of California agriculture, that's that southern part, and it shares a border with Mexico. And of that water, it's used to grow what we can think of as winter salad vegetables. So a lot of lettuce and broccoli, a lot of sugar beets, as well as alfalfa. I think a quarter of the water is used to grow alfalfa in that region. And if people want to learn more about this region and the agriculture there, I actually, as I mentioned, don't study those crops. But one of my colleagues, Dr. Jairo Diaz, runs the Desert Research Center through UC in the Imperial Valley, and we did a podcast episode with him called Agriculture in the Borderlands, and I would recommend listening to that to just learn, because it is just a wildly different type of agriculture that's going on there with a growing season of 11 months out of the year, and really meeting a lot of the needs during moments where not much else is growing in the United States. Green onions, forgot about green onions. I love green onions, so gotta mention them.
Of course.
Add a point to all this is that I'm not entirely sure, why this question gets sort of a lot of play, because to me it's just you're going to have a trade if we weren't using water for agriculture, of course, which is almost like a dumb question in general, because we of course have to do that. But if that land were to go into something else, it would probably go into just basically a despoiled kind of condition. It would become an environmental nuisance, if not a catastrophe. So when we think about how much water this uses, I mean that water being used on that ranch or on that field is doing us a huge favor of preventing massive weed outbreaks, massive desertification in and of itself. So particularly the high elevation pastures that we have in Colorado, if those lands weren't irrigated, what replaces that is something much worse than what we really want to deal with or have the money to deal with.
I think that's an interesting point as the ecosystem value that irrigation could bring.
Yeah.
And Mallika, you had earlier in your presentation talked about how irrigation is a given in California and in the Western United States, right? Like for you to produce, you need to irrigate for the most part. And with climate change and increasing temperatures, like within our district as an example, in the last century, we're seeing temperature increases of 1.5 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit. And that research shows is linked to stream flow impacts. And so we have decreased stream flow because of higher temperatures. And so how can we support farmers and producers in a hotter, drier future? You guys presented a little bit on some technologies, but in the short term, how can we support them?
Oh, me? Okay. All right. Some of this is really boring. Because I think one of the first things that I tell the growers that I work with, and nobody wants to hear this from me, is I ask them when the last time they did a distribution uniformity test is. Right? It's like, nobody wants to hear this. And basically what this is a test of your system, right? And it's making sure that these systems that we're investing so much in to perform irrigation are functioning optimally. And we have evidence that they are not always functioning optimally. And if they're not, it means that no matter how clever you think you're being with your irrigation, and in California, our irrigation systems are micro sprinklers or drip irrigation or subsurface drip, so it's always a grid. And if there are leaks in that grid, if there are clogs in that grid, then there's parts of it that are getting more water and there's parts of it that are getting less water. And you're not applying what you think you're applying. And if you are fertigating and also applying nutrients, then that gets off too. So that's kind of like the dirty, secret, boring thing that I really bring up because it is so important. To make sure that we're managing these systems optimally. And if that is being done, then kind of the next steps are some of the precision types of work that we talked about, where if you feel like you are already a really good irrigation manager with your basic system, then you can try some of these more nuanced techniques to further grid up your fields to better manage water according to the soil types that are there and the subtle differences in soil types that are there. The other area is the deficit irrigation, right? So a warmer climate, a climate where evapotranspiration demand, the irrigation demand is going to increase. How do you use that water as strategically as you can over the growing season, right? Like, are there spots in the growing season where you can cut back without impacting your yield? So that's another strategy I think that's really important to manage a growing climate. And if you haven't experimented with that, it's something to consider for sure. And then, we're going to talk about alternative or new crops, but then there's also breeding, right? So in almonds, for example, across the state of California, there's several variety trials looking at both varieties of the trees themselves and then also different varieties of the rootstocks and how we pair these things together and trying to understand, what is more drought tolerant in this changing climate. So, yeah.
Thanks. And Perry or Claudia, if you want to add to that, you're more than welcome to.
Just from a global perspective, we have a huge underinvestment in agricultural research and a huge underinvestment also in irrigation, research in irrigation management, irrigation technologies. So, there's just not a lot of interest by private sector, and even governments are severely underinvesting in that. Of course, the underinvestment is largest in low-income countries where we see almost no investment. So agriculture just in low-income countries contributes a very large share of GDP, but just nothing is being invested, unfortunately. And so everything that we've just heard, I think, is just essential. There's very clear a lot more food that we can get out of the areas here. There's, as we've heard, there's a lot of a lot of management that is not optimized. Even driving down here from Aspen, we saw active irrigation. So there were some sprinklers and all kinds of things were running in the rain, right? Which tells me it's probably not, people are not quite serious about water shortages yet. And then also I sometimes go to places and I say, what's your monthly domestic water bill? If people don't know, that means they don't pay enough. So, people don't, then there's no incentive to conserve water if you actually don't even know, how much you pay for it. I come from Germany originally, you ask anyone in Germany, they will tell you how much their water bill is because they find it weighs very heavily on them. So you see lots of little illegal wells and showing up in all kinds of places and lots of little illegal rooftop rainwater harvesting systems. All of that is, officially you can have a lot of these things, but people just put them in to avoid paying this very high domestic water bills. I haven't seen, wherever I go in the US or Canada, people don't know how much they pay. In fact, where I live in Montreal, we don't even have a water meter. So I can use as much water as I want. It's just, at the end of the year, they check how much water was used by our town, and they just put it on top of our property tax. So that's why we have a lot of swimming pools there that shouldn't be there. They wouldn't be there if we would actually have to pay for the water that we use at the household level. So anyway, I'm just saying there's a lot of things that can be done. We know from a domestic use perspective that people get quite creative when they know how much they pay for their water bill. We know in industrial sectors there's still a lot that can be done in terms of reusing water, recycling water, and I guess even in agriculture, I'm sure there's a lot of opportunities, especially downstream. But very clearly, maybe just to add again, this place here is getting much hotter yet to come. There will be, we are not out of any drought here. We're right in the middle. It's going to get a lot worse, and this is the same situation globally. But the infrastructure here is so much better developed. And so I think the key is to do yet a much better job in producing food. We don't want people to stop here producing food because a lot of that gets exported, including to low-income countries, because there we can't get productivity up fast enough to address. That's why we see the growing number of people that go hungry. So, but for agriculture to survive, given the rapid population growth and domestic water demand, and to survive sustainably. It doesn't make sense to keep drawing down on groundwater to levels that are impossible to recharge. So I think everyone here has to come together upstream and downstream and find solutions. And I think a lot of the solutions exist, but then we don't have sufficient incentives for the uptake of those solutions. So we really have to work I think at all levels to adopt and to incentivize the adoption of more water conserving solutions. And I also wanted to bring this up. In high income, we deal a lot with diets. So 80% of people in sub-Saharan Africa, 70% of people in Asia, South Asia, cannot afford a balanced diet. So they can't afford eggs or milk or whatever it is, or not sufficient vegetables and fruits. So we want to change that. But then in many high-income countries, including on average United States, we have kind of an excessive consumption of some very water-intensive foods, starting with sugar cane. We really should drastically reduce it if we really want to conserve water for the planet. Sugarcane is one of the largest water users globally. There's also a lot of cotton still irrigated, and we don't need to constantly buy new clothes, right? There is not really a need for that. And then, of course, we also have some overconsumption of meat products here, actually to the extent that we see health challenges, right? A very high public health bill from poor food consumption that is very water intensive. So that's also something to look into. So if you're seriously, also given our warming planet, we want to address climate change, we want to address those growing water shortages that are directly linked to the warming planet as well, to some extent. And so if you want to address all of that, we have to really look from farm to fork. So we can't just say, oh, it's all in the ag sector only. It's also, because ag sector affects only some people. Like there's only so many farmers, especially in the United States, and it's different in other countries where you still have more farmers. But everyone is consuming food. So if you really want to make a difference, we also have to look at the consumption. Thank you.
No, thank you, Claudia, for that. And I'll ask a more local question to you, Perry, because I think we have some local producers here too. And when we look at the Colorado's western slope, 90% of the agricultural lands are run by families, and so they're not a large scale, they're like a small operation. And when we're looking at making them more efficient, what suggestions, even for us at the River District, would you see to help them conserve water and become more efficient?
I assume that everybody here is sort of familiar with the concept of water efficiency versus water conservation. Yeah, so I mean,
I think you should speak a little bit to that too, because I think that is a convoluted topic at times.
That's extremely convoluted topic, but in the context of Colorado water law, there is a difference between conserving water and being efficient with water. And the reason why that's an important question is because it directly affects what kind of policy or approach you might do to cause that specific fraction of the water right to arise. The river doesn't know the difference as to why you're diverting less, but there are two reasons why you would do that. One, you could be conserving water by growing a crop that just demands less water. So that's conserved water that affects the farmer's bottom line. That's a beneficial use reduction, which is compensable to the farmer. They're foregoing a diversion, so to not grow something, which they normally would have the usufructuary right to do. So then that's where compensation comes in, and they can transfer and shepherd and lease, and smarter people than me can figure out how to move that water to Lake Powell and other places like that. Efficiency is a whole different thing. So if we convert a flood irrigated field into a more highly efficient field, you will need the same amount of water, if not slightly more, depending on the configuration of your field, to grow that crop. You haven't changed the crop, so it's going to demand the same amount of water, if not more, even because you're going to be more optimal with your application. You would divert less because your basic infrastructural system, your delivery system, doesn't need the carriage, doesn't need the flow, the return flows and everything else. So when you ask me how we can help farmers be more efficient in this massive area of small scale farmers, my mind immediately goes to the high elevation pasture farmers, which if we wanted to have sort of a quid pro quo, with farmers, say, you would divert less water. And of course, that's not a compensated fraction of water, because they would still have access to the beneficial use fraction of that water right. But the quid pro quo would be a sprinkler system. So I will say that I am much more in favor of long-term solutions that improve the infrastructure. I've already provided the quote, which kind of gives away my central thesis here, is I would be much more in favor of long-term, more durable infrastructure solutions that might see conversion of flood irrigated systems into sprinkler systems, whether they're side rolls or linear move systems. That takes us into the future. That's the step we need to take. And we may consume the same amount, but then you have the opportunity to play with the diversion timing of that water. If you don't need that same amount of water at that head gate at that time, then you can hold it in a place like a high elevation reservoir where it's not subject to the same level of evaporation that it would be as you're trying to move it through our hot summer climate. So it gives you a lot more flexibility. And you would find parallels to this in any industry where you want to produce more efficiency, flexibility. Consumers want those kinds of things, and you see the sort of optimization of resources that grows out of that. So if I could, wave a magic wand, I would love to see improved infrastructure. Claudia already talked about that. It's almost like a basic answer to we need to invest in our infrastructure. We need to be rethinking what we consider infrastructure in that regard. So those small family farms, the education and other things like that come along with it. But, we've learned how to use GPS tractors and things like that, and so we can learn how to use those new systems also.
Yeah, and especially if in the future years we're looking at less water in the river, maybe the water for diversion won't be available for a flood irrigation system, or you won't have the flexibility there. And so I think those are great thoughts.
Well,
Go
and I
ahead.
can add to say, I think, the farmers that are the most interested in those kinds of systems, they are the farmers that have the junior water rights. And, and then of course somebody's going to say, well, yeah, well, if I don't divert it, somebody else downstream is going to snatch it. And, there is definitely a reality there. But if you're really talking about a sort of a district-wide or wholesale system, it takes a broader network of consideration to make it. One guy does it one place, and his foregone diversion just goes to somebody else. That's not where we want to head with this. We want to talk about large-scale, adaptations.
And is it okay? I'm going to ask one more question, and then maybe we turn over to the general public. But one thing, when listening to the three of you present, and Claudia, you had mentioned, the increase in energy prices and how that's impacting food production. And one topic that's coming up here in the state of Colorado, but in other places, is agrivoltaic and generating energy at the farm level as well. And so I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are there and how that could potentially tie into reimagined, irrigation future.
I have a lot to say about solar because this is you've already seen at least a little solar panel. Let's maybe first Sub-Saharan Africa, and then I can also mention a few other examples. In Sub-Saharan Africa, the majority of the rural population has no access to electricity. So very simple, there is no no great energy source, right? So they use firewood and cow dung and crop residues for cooking fuel, and there's not much else. So solar is very clearly a solution for many things in that region. And given that there's few public or large scale or infrastructure for irrigation, so we also, farmers dig their wells, and then either they have a hand pump or the motorized pumps are usually diesel. And with exactly this energy price crisis that we have in parallel with the food price crisis, and actually also for them a fertilizer price crisis, presumably here fertilizer prices are also higher, pesticides, etc. Solar is certainly a solution that we are promoting for all kinds of beneficial benefits. The challenge, of course, is the very high initial investment cost. Solar panels the cost has also gone up with everything else. But yes, so that's certainly we call it productive use, systems. So we are looking for the application of clean energy technologies for growing ag productivity. And so it's both there's processing, there is solar cooling systems, because again, if you don't have energy, you produce milk, but you can't actually cool it, can't really store it. So you have a lot of perishable, a lot of challenges with rapidly perishing commodities. This being said, of course, we have seen, especially in parts of South Asia, where solar groundwater pumps have been subsidized for some time. So we have about 500,000 very large solar irrigation pumps in operation in India, and maybe 50, 60,000 of these very big solar pumps in operation in Pakistan, because none of them, get enough surface irrigation, so they have all switched to groundwater, which is depleting. So it's also, unfortunately, not very sustainable. So we are, it's a good thing, but it's also a dangerous thing, because with diesel, you had to pay variable costs for pumping. And so, farmers were using that irrigation water very optimally. And of course, those systems go in areas where water is particularly scarce. Solar pumps, and so we see there's certainly anecdotal evidence of more rapid depletion of groundwater, or more rapid drawdown of groundwater tables in areas where solar has come in, where before we had either expensive diesel or we had electricity that wasn't really supplied very often. So, like in parts of Pakistan, you have electricity 4 hours a day or something. So that's not uncommon. So yeah, solar is definitely a big solution. This being said, and now maybe moving to other countries, Germany solar also has been subsidized for rooftops, so it's very common to have solar on your rooftop. And then also a lot of farms, especially you see it when you drive along German highways, a lot of farms have converted to solar. They just produce solar energy. So they went out of agriculture. It just didn't make sense. The areas were too small. Various other reasons, right? Old farmers, there's no children who want to go into farming, so they just all converted them into solar farms. I think it's going quite well. I mean, it's well supported. In Asia, they're, obviously they don't want to develop those big solar farms, but they sometimes put up the panels on top and they grow the crops at the bottom. And there's also this idea, there's some pilots where you do have electricity access in rural areas in parts of South Asia, especially in India, that they feed the solar energy back into the system, and the hope is that then they don't deplete the groundwater as much, and they have two sources of income, so income from producing electricity and income from producing crops. So those are some of the solutions that are being looked into. But very clearly solar is a game changer in terms of irrigation development in low-income countries. So it very clearly is making a very big difference. But not necessarily, not necessarily positive for the planet, positive for food production. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Claudia. I don't know if, Mallika, you have thoughts there too, because I think it's being also explored regionally.
Yeah, absolutely. I can tell you what we're up to in California. So we have a policy called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And it's to manage our groundwater. Groundwater hadn't been managed until this policy was passed in 2014 during the mega drought. And some projections are that almost 500,000 acres of land might have to go out of agricultural production in order to meet the groundwater sustainability goals for the state. So that's kind of one part of this, right? The other part is the state has, really ambitious goals in development of solar energy. And so how can we accomplish all of these goals, right? And I think of agrivoltaics as, it's a system that combines the production of solar energy and agricultural production on the same parcel. And I have to give credit to my colleague, Dr. Majdi Abu Najm. He is an expert in agrivoltaic systems in the state, and he's really spearheading these efforts. And he is also my office buddy. He's like down the hall from me, so he's explained this to me a bunch of times. So because basically the idea here is that 1 + 1 = 3, because you have, and I also try to think of it when I've talked to him as layers, right? You have a layer on the same parcel of solar production, and you have another layer of agricultural production. And what this involves is kind of thinking about, from a farmer's perspective, thinking about this parcel in terms of its profits, right? So and Dr. Abu Najm has done studies now, some pilot studies in processing tomatoes as a crop. So if you have processing tomatoes in conjunction with solar panels, the actual yield of the processing tomato is going to be less, but the water requirement is also significantly less. And then there's this opportunity to mitigate heat stress because you have some shade from the solar panels. So this is the opportunity for this state that's being heavily pursued when it comes to agrivoltaic systems. And we together, because I work in extension, so Majdi Abu Najm, my colleague, he was just like, can we start talking to some farmers about this? And so we did some focus groups with farmers, and boy, did they have a lot of great ideas and logistical challenges, right? And that I think is going to be a big issue. Is in it, you do the science, and the science starts to look pretty good, and then it's time to do the extension, where we're thinking about, well, how is machinery going to go through these fields? How are we going to do management on these fields? What are these solar panels going to take now? Why, and really the thinking through of why not just have solar and just have farming? Why the both, I think, is going to be the big need for extension on that front. But that's kind of what's happening in California. But I think it's going to happen. I think we're going to see more and more agrivoltaic systems, especially when we start to see those fallow lands.
Thank you. And Perry, you are welcome to add to that too, but I think we'll turn over to the general public to keep in line with our time constraints.
Yeah, quick show of hands here. Who has a burning question? Because I can start off with a virtual one, but then I'll know who to go to next. Okay. I will start with our virtual crowd. So Patrick Hunter wanted to know, what about changing the types of plants for a drier and hotter climate?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. I will say that the agrivoltaic question is interesting because we have a project at the research center directed by Professor Horace Gaspari, and we've had producers ask about these things. And here I like to give my favorite Yogi Berra quote, which is basically all you need to know about extension, which is, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. So most farmers have to ask us, how am I supposed to do this at my farm? So on that note, the kinds of crops that we are looking at for alternatives to Patrick, to answer his question, the forage issue is what drives everything in terms of consumptive water use, largely in Colorado, or at least on the western side of Colorado. So, I mentioned the Kernza project with Kernza and Sandfoin and Silphium, which are, if you've read your Sand County Almanac, you know about Silphium, and Sandfoin is sort of making a return, and Kernza is this really exciting intermediate wheatgrass. So it's an intermediate wheatgrass, and any farmer here is going to say, well, intermediate wheatgrass, nothing to write home about. So protein levels are lower, yields are different, but it's a perennial wheatgrass, and it's a perennial grain, and it is demonstrated to be highly drought tolerant, as is Sandfoin. I mean, I've literally grown it in basically concrete, and it's extremely durable kind of crop. So breeding those crops through the Land Institute, which I commend for the work that they're doing, takes us down the pathway of these alternative alternative crops, which we have to consider. We have the equivalent is wheat and alfalfa. So these things have to be monetarily worked out. Farmers are market takers, not market makers. They just grow Sandfoin and suddenly everybody's going to want to eat Sandfoin. It doesn't work that way. People have to want to eat that crop first. So the alternative to that is to make the intermediate wheatgrass be comparable to the things we already eat. So that's the long-term solution there. And along the way, though, we have these drought-tolerant crops, which allow us to allow that farmer to enter into a conservation program. Because what I said before, efficiency system's not going to do a damn thing to help you conserve water. You're going to probably use more water. But if we're trying to conserve, we reduce our consumptive use with these alternative crops. And so those farmers then have the ability to go into these leasing arrangements temporarily without jeopardizing their farms, and likely get monetarily compensated for those foregone diversions. So to me, it's the 1 + 1 = 3 kind of a thing. They can have a couple different revenue streams without altering their their current. They don't have to move, basically, uproot and go someplace else. So we love the Land Institute. I'm thrilled to be working with them.
Yeah, maybe. Just from a global perspective, when we deal with very dry areas and drying areas, what we have seen is a switch, from low-value staple crops and also some irrigated pastures into high-value vegetables and fruits. So that's a shift. Obviously, also out of rice and other high water-intensive crops, out of cotton, out of sugarcane for sure. So that's a global shift. You look into areas that are drying, areas that have less water. So that is the global shift we've been seeing. So Australia, Morocco. So all of these countries, have moved into very little water. What is the highest ag value that you can generate happens to be usually fruits and vegetables. And I think there have been dramatic shifts already in the Colorado Basin crop production systems. I think there used to be more rice and potentially even more irrigated alfalfa. So I think there have been some changes. But of course, at the same time, those farmers who are doing this have become much more productive. So that's why, I guess, in total production, you still have a lot. And of course, the water rights system, locks you into some kind of production systems that wouldn't exist if you really would optimize just based on changing water scarcities. And then these very large reservoirs have also helped this basin to postpone, some decisions that eventually have to be taken. So, but that's basically globally the move. where things are going when the water situation gets tough. Yeah.
Okay, and maybe, I know we're kind of coming up on time here, but maybe I'll save a really juicy question that we've gotten. This actually came from Spain, from the context of, well, no, it's really relevant for all three of you. So from Elena Lopez Gunn, she is writing from Spain, where she was calling out that they're along with a lot of Mediterranean countries in the EU, are struggling with drought. So she wanted to know, how can we adapt various water rights systems to the need to be more adaptive in management due to climate change, and how do we bring equity and fairness principles into that? And she said she's really interested in lots of these water rights systems. So this was not, I'm not trying to throw you under the bus here on how we're going to fix like the Colorado River Compact, but if anyone wants to weigh in on various adaptive water rights systems that are being adapted right now.
I think you already explained it by, I think the water banking that you had proposed is obviously a system that works very well when you have water rights systems. So that, you bank your water for a future year or against some kind of payment in whatever, financial whatever, that you give up your water right in a short term, put it, for other users that might be willing to pay, right, for this water use. I mean, we've seen a lot of water use rights moving from agriculture to domestic industrial sector in the Western United States. So this has been a very long-term move for decades now. So, but I think the key is that farmers get compensated, that farmers don't need to give up farming, right? You can just give up a very small share of your water right against compensation. Either you put it in a bank, in a water bank for future reuse when maybe the water situation is better, or you receive some compensation that you can use to invest in this beautiful irrigation technology that you've showed on, I don't know, slide number, one of your early slides. So there's a lot of ways. In fact, the water rights systems, do a lot of very good things that places where farmers don't have water use rights, which is the majority, almost everywhere in the world, there the farmers will simply not get the compensation. And they can't say, oh, I'm willing to give up 10% of my historic water use for 5 years. They can't say that. They can say that, but no one will listen because there will be no compensation. So yeah, but I think you mentioned that example of the water banking. I don't know if that's active here, but certainly can be activated.
I know, there have been examinations of how water banking might work, and there are provisions, within even Colorado water law that sort of, lead you to a place where that kind of, system could be adopted. But I think that the questioner might be conflating two issues here, because what I heard something along the lines of like adapting or changing, or I felt like the question was direct, taking us down to where we're trying
like adapting water rights systems.
Yeah, I mean, when I hear adapting a water rights system, I feel like the question is really about how do you work within. Maybe that's just the question I want to answer. The question is really how do you work within the current water rights system, and these are usufructuary water rights. These are rights to use. These are legacy, kind of carryover. You own a piece of land, you bequeath that. This is an entrenched model of how we use water in Colorado. So working within that system invariably takes you into the voluntary compensated realm, which I think is a perfectly fair thing to do, and this is just my opinion, for farmers who have inherited those water rights. The water right would still go to a beneficial use because it would be moved to someplace else where that compensated, or the paying party would be taking it, so it would still get used. But I don't think adapting water rights systems is a question that anybody really is taking seriously right now.
Okay, well, I'll pass it back to you, Raquel, and maybe we can continue some of the questions offline.
That sounds good.
I need my microphone. I saw, Mallika, you pick up the microphone, so I didn't know if you wanted to add to that question.
Oh, I was just going to say, so I am not a legal expert on water rights, but I would say just something that I think is important to speak to on the equity front is just to consider how new systems or new policies are going to always consider how they're going to impact socially disadvantaged communities and small farmers. Like in a recent case was with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, there's this idea that there'd be self-organization of communities into these groundwater sustainability agencies that would get together and come up with these plans, right? And I think anytime we think of something as just, self-organization or something is gonna just happen, in our history, that's always favored a privileged group of people. And that's kind of what we saw happen very recently in California, where folks who already weren't connected into these communities and systems were left out, and there wasn't necessarily a space for them to be in these conversations. And so because of that, many folks weren't necessarily included in the groundwater planning for where they were. If you from small farms or from socially disadvantaged communities, there wasn't always language access available, things like this. So that was one thing I was gonna say, and I think as a part of the land grant institution, a way that we can, help to advocate for small farmers is to support extension small farm programs. So that was just the thing I wanted to share on that front.
Thanks. And just, Emily, for clarity, we should wrap up? I think so. Okay. Well, thank you. Yes, Claudia.
We should at least hear from a few people in the room. They all must have some ideas, So let's say really you have to reduce your water consumption by 20%. How would you do it? Yeah? I mean, if you have a farm, you have a home, you might have a swimming pool, I don't know what you have. Just some ideas. This is a reality. So I think at least 20% consumption has to go down. It's
well, and that could be
river flows are going down. There's just no doubt there. So just some opinions. Maybe if you can just pass the microphone.
Well, we do have a reception with our local guests here,
oh,
so that actually would be
us.
a great primer to continue the conversation. But in the meantime, maybe we could adjourn for now with our virtual audience. And thank you. I don't know if you have any final thoughts.
No, that sounds great, and just a round of applause to our great panelists. Thank you very much.